And this is why they call Maine vacation land. I mean, sure, we're basically Winterfell 6 months out of the year, but there is a brief moment after the muddy spring and the admittedly far superior colorful autumn in which it all kind of makes sense. One of the reasons why I started this channel, along with just wanting attention, of course, did I put enough sunscreen on my tits? Is that I wish to talk about aspects of non-monogamy that don't tend to get as much focus. So much of the conversations in the mainstream media tend to focus on how to make non-monogamy mesh with traditional ideas of monogamous relationships. There's a lot of confusion, and that confusion mirrors the conversations that we've seen and are still going on, honestly, around queer relationships and how those work. How do you and your girlfriend, and sure, it's very easy to dismiss this and just sort of make fun of it. But I don't think everyone expressing this opinion is just a straight up homophobe. Queer people themselves sometimes can also be confused. Which makes sense. If your whole framing of how sex is supposed to work is through a cis-normative, heteronormative frame rate, the idea of a penis penetrating a vagina, then of course you're going to be confused about anything that's outside of that norm. The same can be said for romantic relationships. If your whole understanding of how romantic relationships work is that of a man and a woman exclusively being together till death or alimony sought do you part, then the idea of something else outside of that can just seem, confusing. How do you and your husband and his boyfriend, The problem is that if you only ever look at something in comparison to the accepted norm, it actually makes it harder for it to exist as its own thing. It will forever exist in its shadow. Some queer activists, for example, say it was a mistake for us to advocate so hard for marriage equality because it actually is a heteronormative ideal. It's a way of assimilating to our dominant culture as opposed to letting it exist on its own. Very much related to this conversation might be that of understanding non-binary identities. For some people, non-binary is just a nonsensical word. It just does not compute, especially depending on where and when you grew up, which sadly I can attest to. I grew up in Central Maine in the 90s. I didn't even know that people outside the gender binary existed until college. And when I found out at first, I was really confused. So how do you, this is gender, everybody. So I had non-binary explained to me in terms and in words that I understood. Like someone who's both a man and a woman, or floating in between. And not a third gender per se, but something that exists outside of that binary. And that was a very useful stepping stone, but ultimately still a little bit flawed because it still forces an idea of understanding non-binary through the accepted and understood template of what gender even is. The truth is there is no one definition of gender itself. So non-binary can be a three-dimensional spectrum of what Harker the Storyteller put as chaotic good times. It can be an experience that is none of the above, or it can just be looking at gender and going, no thank you, I've had quite enough of that already. There is no single consensus, and frankly, I don't think there should be. The point of all of this is to say that sometimes language is limited, and to understand new concepts and ideas, it sometimes helps for us to look at those initial understood assumptions to see how flexible they actually can be. It's not perfect, but it can be very beneficial in understanding new ideas and introducing them to other people. Sometimes, in order to be able to step off of a well-walked path, we first have to talk about why that path even exists. Then we can explore other options to traverse it. Like instead maybe climbing through the canopy or flying alongside it. Or perhaps we'll just flop down in the ground instead and go, screw this path, I'm tired and I'm taking a nap. Very relatable, that last sentiment. This video is very much structured to be accessible to those who may not really understand how one can be polyamorous, but not in the traditional marrying of monogamy way. And because of that, I unfortunately do have to make some comparisons that might not sit so well with my more radical comrades. I am trying to reach people where they're at to eventually get them to where I hopefully would like them to be. I hope that makes sense. I'm really worried that this is a little bit too pretentious of an opening, to be honest with you. With all of that preamble out of the way, let's talk about the way that I and some people choose to structure our romantic relationships. To put it very simply, I am functionally single. Single? God damn it.
Part 1. What is solo polyamory?
Solo polyamory is a type of polyamory that is focused mostly on autonomy, usually characterized by a strong desire to keep one's life separate from their partners. Many solo polyamorous have no desire to ever cohabitate with partners, get married, or share finances. Now, there are some exceptions to this, of course, and we're going to talk more about those later. But the takeaway for now to note is that for many solo polyamorous, the idea of picking favorites or creating any kind of hierarchy in their relationships feels like a lot of unnecessary work. On the website solopoly.net, Amy Gahran, who at the time went by Aggie Says, defines solo poly like this.
What distinguishes solo poly people is that we generally don't have intimate relationships which involve, or are heading toward, primary style merging of life infrastructure or identity along the lines of the traditional social relationship escalator. For instance, we generally don't share a home or finances with any intimate partners. Similarly, solo poly people generally don't identify very strongly as part of a couple or triad, etc. We prefer to operate and present ourselves as individuals.
You know how sometimes you're talking to somebody who is just like so enamored with the fact that their identity is paired with that of a partner? You know, they use we in every sentence. We went to the farmer's market the other day. We saw that Marvel movie and really liked it. We had to go to the emergency room yesterday for Ron's IBS. Well, solo polyamorous typically really hate that. We much prefer to be seen as autonomous individuals and not as part of a unit. And by the way, I totally understand that some of this is just the way language works, you know, we is the plural. I totally understand that. I'm not trying to say it's automatic cringe for me. My point is that that kind of language can erase individuality sometimes, and that can make people really uncomfortable. I find words and just how we use them to be really fascinating, you know? I actually think I could have made a really good linguist, you know? I think I would have been really smart at it. Intelligent, maybe. You might. Fuck! Cutting linguist. That's a joke I'm trying to make. Fuck, I can't do it with a straight face. I keep trying. Solo polyamory can in part be as a reaction to the way that some monogamous people choose to still structure their relationships in a way that mirrors monogamous ideals they grew up with. While some find a lot of ease and comfort in doing this monogamy plus manner of relationships, solo polyamorous prefer to approach things in a more individualistic manner. Some of them have actually been burned by more hierarchical approaches before in the past and actually find this structure to be a lot more freeing and makes them feel like their needs are getting met. Now, my regular viewers may notice pretty quickly that this bears a lot of resemblance to relationship anarchy, which you can watch this video over here if you haven't seen it. And that is very astute. Good job. You get a relationship anarchist merit badge. An important distinction to notice between the two is that relationship anarchy is more of a relationship philosophy that can be applied over all kinds of relationships, whereas solo polyamory is focused on how one creates, maintains, and structures romantic relationships. That isn't to say there isn't a fair amount of overlap, there 100% is. And in fact, some people may actually call themselves a combination of the two. I, for one, tend to call myself a solo polyamorous with a lot of relationship anarchy sprinkled on. What solo polyam and relationship anarchy have in common is the rejection of the traditional relationship escalator. We've actually talked about this on my channel now a couple of times. The relationship escalator describes a series of events that a dating pair is expected to go through during the development of that relationship. In her book, Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator, Gahran actually starts off the book with a fictitious example of a dating pair going through the traditional relationship escalator. It's pretty long and kind of detailed, so we're not going to go through the whole thing, but here's like a nice little summarized highlight reel.
Chris and Dana meet. They date, sparks fly. They eventually say love you to each other and become Facebook official. They become a monogamous pair, exclusive to each other. They sometimes become jealous, even possessive, and start spending all their free time together. After a few months of this, they start making all their major decisions together. They move into a shared apartment, share a bed, and merge finances. Chris proposes to Dana. She says yes, and they get married before popping out a few babies. They have their struggles, of course, but they remain faithful to each other until Chris finally kicks the bucket. Dana inherits his stuff and lives out the rest of her life as a widow. The end.
Some people may choose to do certain parts of this trajectory, but then reject others. For example, you might have children with somebody, but never get married. Or you might get married and never have children. I actually knew a woman who got married to her husband, but they actually still lived in separate houses. And as a kid, my mind was just absolutely blown by this, right? I couldn't believe someone could do that. But as an adult, I'm like, clever girl. Sometimes just by being ourselves, we are automatically disqualified from the relationship escalator. The pop culture image of the family is still cis, straight, white, at least middle class, able-bodied. But what if you're trans? Or black? Or queer? Those kind of assumptions make it much harder to fit in to what your life is supposed to look like if you're already at a disadvantage. Which is why for some people, the answer is assimilation, to try and force your life to fit into this mold, even though your very existence usually means you wouldn't actually fit into it. Non-monogamous people can sometimes mirror their relationships like monogamy by having a primary partner whose actions are the ones that they prioritize at all times. Primaries are the ones who are typically acknowledged publicly. They get to attend events with their partner, like say a wedding or something like that, and also are the ones whose schedule all others will have to rotate around. Secondary partners can quite often, though I'm sure not always intentionally, become second priorities. Secondaries are often not getting to be as public about their relationship with the person, and also may have their schedule suddenly canceled or disrupted if the partner's primary partner demands it. While a primary partner is often the beneficiary of couples privilege, secondaries usually are not. Not to mention, a lot of these more hierarchical structures tend to have veto power, which may allow a primary to suddenly halt a relationship in its tracks with a secondary, sometimes without even there being any discussion first. Now, some people look at all of that and say, well, yeah, how else are you supposed to have a relationship with someone? And that is what solo polyamory helps to challenge. And to be fair to non-monogamous people with this style of dating, the more hierarchical kind, it makes sense that it happens considering how many of us come into the non-monogamy waters as once being part of a couple that then decided to open up for some reason. So it totally makes sense, and I'm not saying that it's wrong or necessarily bad or anything like that. I'm just pointing out that people who come into those relationships sometimes can end up getting the short end of the stick due to no fault of their own. Meanwhile, there are some people, like me, who come into non-monogamy essentially single, no current partners or potential partners even lined up. And sometimes that's deliberate. Some people much prefer the idea of jumping into non-monogamy by themselves. For others, it's more due to circumstance. Maybe they would prefer a more traditional structure, but they just don't happen to have one yet. I'm a bit of both in a way, someone who came in single by circumstance, but then also decided to embrace it. I left a loving monogamous relationship to try polyamory out, and I was almost overwhelmed immediately by the way the conversation was shaped around partnered language. You know, so much of the discussion was how we make our existing partners pair up okay with our new partners, how to handle each other's jealousy and fight through those harsh feelings when our partners meet other people. And of course, how the hell to feel compersion already? How do I feel it? What's the secret ingredient? So for those of us who don't fit into the mold by circumstance or design, we find ourselves needing to find a different way to navigate things. Now, Tristan Taormino, the sex educator and author of the book Opening Up, has a bit of a different definition that I definitely want to touch on. According to Taormino, the definition of solo poly is somebody who sees themselves as their primary partner and never desires a real one. And this definition, while it may resonate with some people, it personally has a few problems for me. For one thing, this language still assumes a primary as the norm. It doesn't really push back against that. And also, self-partnered has some specific implications. According to the article, single, self-partnered, or solo polyamorous,
self-partner means an individual isn't single and searching for the one to change their status from single to taken. Self-partnered means a person is committing to be alone. A self-partnered individual takes time to put their needs, desires, dreams, art, health, and priorities first.
Maybe some solo polyamorous people do relate to that. Certainly the writer, a fellow Amanda, so obviously a trustworthy source, does. And that's 100% fine. I just know that for myself, my committing to solo polyamory isn't about committing to being alone. I actually am very social and love company. I'm constantly filling up my schedule with all kinds of events, platonic, sexual, and romantic. Plus, prioritizing myself being seen as the equivalent to a romantic relationship with someone feels a little weird to me. I don't know, I just feel like self-love isn't really the same as romantic love of another person. It just doesn't really quite track. So yeah, personally, I'm not a big fan of this definition. But I think this is touching on that comparison problem again, the way that language can sometimes fail us when we're trying to understand new concepts that are outside of the traditional norm. If it helps to think of traditional hierarchical non-monogamy as being a mirror to monogamous relationships, then it might help to think of solo polyamory as being a sort of mirror to single living. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that as solo polyamory has risen in visibility and relevance in the non-monogamy world, we've also been seeing quite an increase in popularity of singlehood in the monogamous one.
Part 2. The Rise of Singlehood.
In his book, Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone, Eric Kleinenberg shares a few reasons why singlehood has seen such a rise in popularity. He links the rise to 4 things. The migration of people from more rural areas into urban ones starting around the 1960s. The communications revolution, i.e. the invention of the phone, for example, which allowed people living in isolation to still have rich social lives. As well as women being able to now enter the workforce, thus earning their own living and being able to live independently, as well as the longer lives that people live these days, i.e. people outliving their spouses and then having to live by themselves. The urbanization of life is a particular focus of the book.
Singles, including those who lived alone, didn't have to confine themselves to particular buildings, clubs, neighborhoods, or cities. A growing number of places, gyms, coffee shops, clubs, residential complexes, and services, cleaning, food preparation, home delivery, were being developed with their needs and interests in mind.
In light of all of this, it makes a lot of sense why single living is seeing such a rise in visibility in both non-monogamous and monogamous spaces. Solo polyamorous, such as myself, can maintain our autonomy, but still also have plenty of opportunities to socialize and connect with other people. Now, I do want to make a point to mention before we move on that while I did enjoy this book in a, general helping me to research way, I did have a few problems with it. For example, sometimes the way that he describes his interviewees comes off a bit insulting. Like, he calls one woman big boned. No, no. Nope, 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 nope. Also notice some blind spots, like just very little attention given at all to ways that singlehood can intersect with other lived experiences, like, being black or being disabled. No mention of trans people at all. Everything is very gender binary. And also, being a leftist, I would have liked a little more criticism of capitalism in there, but, maybe that's just me. Also, non-monogamy literally was not mentioned once in the book, but to be honest with you, I kind of expected that. The rise in singlehood visibility is really interesting because as much as it's being studied and monitored, it still doesn't feel like it's being properly understood. There is a lot of focus on the alone part of being single, as though single people are just like never venturing outside of our cat-filled apartments. But in actuality, single people are more likely to be social than our married counterparts. Kleinenberg writes,
Single women, above the age of 35, divorced as well as never married, are more likely than their married contemporaries to do the following activities. See or visit a best friend at least weekly. Have a non-visit contact, such as a call or an email exchange with a best friend, at least weekly. Spend a social evening with neighbors. Regularly participate in informal group activities and be a member of a secular social group. Men above the age 35 who live alone, both divorced and never married, are more likely than men who live with a romantic partner to see or visit a best friend at least weekly, spend a social evening with neighbors or friends, and belong to a social group.
And yet this concern about choosing to live and be romantically single is still seen with a lot of concern. Hell, even in the book, some of the interviewees, including the author himself, at times still express a lot of concern about what they'll do as they age and decline in health. The reality is that many people, particularly women, will tend to outlive their spouses, and children are no guarantee of care. Also, maybe don't have kids with the expectation that they're going to take care of you one day. Just saying. Now, it's important to note that just because there is a rise in singlehood visibility, it doesn't automatically translate into equal rights or status as married folk. Many single people do experience forms of discrimination that are often seen as either innocent or just completely overlooked. For example, being asked to cover the shift of somebody who has kids because it's assumed that they aren't as busy anyway, lacking a real family. Single people also sometimes can be excluded for certain events, sometimes because it's assumed that they just wouldn't want to attend anyway. Now, luckily, I haven't really faced much discrimination myself. I actually have been really lucky in that regard. Maybe just the mere gravity of my personality just brings in all the super dope cool people. But I have heard plenty of stories as well as witnessed other people having to deal with that. In the non-monogamy world, for example, an event meant for an entire polycule may, potentially accidentally, exclude solo polyamorous members because they're not seen as enmeshed in the group, more like lone figures. Or solo polyamorous people may be assumed to have a much more flexible workaround schedule, certainly more flexible than they would if they had a primary partner. Also, there are just not nearly as many financial incentives that are encourage people to stay single in the same way that there are for getting married. And the high price of being single in America, authors Lisa Arnold and Christina Campbell did a comparison between that of what an average single woman pays in healthcare, taxes, etc., to that of her married counterpart. I will have a link to that resource down below if you want to go check that out to see the full breakdown yourself, check their math out. But I can tell you that the final results were staggering.
In each category, the singles paid or lost more than the marrieds. The single woman earning $40,000 paid less than her counterpart earning $80,000, simply because she had less money to start with. When we calculated how much money our characters gained or lost altogether, our single women did indeed fare worse, much worse than the married women. Their lifetime cost of being single? Our lower earning woman paid $484,368 for being single. Our higher earning woman paid $1,022,096, more than $1 million just for being single.
Anecdotally, I can definitely tell you that at times the financial aspect of being a single person can be really overwhelming and frustrating. Everything that I need or have to pay for, I 100% have to take on myself, my bills, my travel, investing in this very channel. Although I do get some help from my Patreon supporters. Thank you so much, I love you. All of that is something I ultimately take on myself. I recognize that if I just cohabitated with a partner or got married, I would instantly be afforded a lot more benefits that would make my life much easier. But I shouldn't have to do that. I would like to think we're all on the same page here, but attaching benefits to marriage or, a job seems completely unnecessary and is really just a way of forcing people to adhere to the life that you think they should have, rather than allowing and supporting the vast varieties of ways that life can be shaped. Also, by attaching benefits to marriage, you're making a situation in which someone might not be able to leave because of those benefits, thus being stuck in an unhealthy, toxic, and maybe even harmful marriage. Now, on the non-monogamy side of things, I do think this is important to sort of focus in on a minute, because the financial aspect of things can be a potential barrier to entering non-monogamy at all. Going out on multiple dates can really add up after a while, even if you're splitting the cost. So solo polyamorous people are sometimes put in the uncomfortable position of having to space out their dates a lot more than their more traditionally entwined counterparts. And sometimes this can translate into some relationship drama because some people want to be able to see their partners at least once a week, which is fair, but not everyone can afford to do that. The potential classist elements of non-monogamy is something that is really interesting but kind of hard to do a deep dive into right now, hence why I have to have it more of an aside. Wanted to at least mention it, But it could be a future video topic, so let me know down below if that's interesting to you. Subscribe down below, hit that bell, help the algorithm. Now, there are some folks out there that are fighting the good fight to make sure that single people do have access and the same kind of rights as married folks. One such organization is called Unmarried Equality. According to their website,
Unmarried Equality advocates for equality and fairness for unmarried people, including people who are single, choose not to marry, cannot marry, or live together before marriage. We provide support and information for this fast-growing constituency, fight discrimination on the basis of marital status, and educate the public and policymakers about relevant social and economic issues. We believe that marriage is only one of many acceptable family forms, and that society should recognize and support healthy relationships in all their diversity.
By the way, the Unmarried Equality website actually does have a section for polyamory, which I am very pleasantly surprised by. Look at all those resources. Check it out.
I think part of what can make single activism a bit difficult to get behind for some folk is that we still tend to see singlehood as a temporary state, something to discard just as quickly as we're able to. Hell, some single people don't even like the word single. In the article, How Single Has Been Rebranded, Vicky Spratt notes that the word single has become so negative for some people that a wide variety of new labels have popped up and been spread as replacement.
You need look no further than the attention that Emma Watson was given when she talked last year about feeling shame as a single woman and opting to use the term self-partnered instead for an example of the fact that society is still weirded out by straight women who aren't currently with a man. Hell, we're so weirded out by ourselves that we're trying to find new labels to make us feel better. See also the rise of the term alonement, which was recently coined by journalist Francesca Spector, who described it as celebrating and valuing the time you spend alone.
In my opinion, there's still a lot of discomfort around seeing people embrace singlehood. And so polyamorous folks can sometimes be accused of having a wanting our cake and eating it too mindset. That we want the attention of loving multiple partners, but at the same time aren't willing to commit to them in the way that is seen as normal and accepted. And don't worry, I got a whole thing coming about the word commit later, so just put a pin in that one too. So many pins. Another concerning trend is the focus of only looking to define single living through the lens of the relationship status or lack thereof. There's this almost obsession with trying to find out, when people are able to actually finally have a romantic relationship or navigate the dating world. That prism of normalcy of looking at us through a coupled lens can actually shape the conversation in a very particular manner, which is limiting and really frustrating. Because single people, much like our married counterparts, aren't just obsessed with our relationships. We have full, interesting lives outside of that. We're not just constantly thinking about dating. Now, originally I was also going to include a part in this video where I was going to talk a little bit about the way that single culture and hustle culture sometimes collide, entrepreneurials, girl boss shit, that kind of thing. But to be honest with you, my last video was really draining, so kind of want to take it easy this time. I had to read 2 books. 2! Wasn't a bi dinosaur in sight. Also, fellow YouTuber and bad bitch John the Duncan actually just recently came out with a really great video about girl bosses and neoliberalism, which is frankly a lot better than what I probably would have talked about, so you should just go watch that. Go there, tell him I sent ya, or don't. I don't control you. Not without a proper discussion around boundaries and expectations first, of course. I just want everyone to know that that's just how I wink. I can't wink, it's bad. For me, the way that singlehood has sort of become embraced and more visible has actually been really validating. Now, obviously, I'm not single in the more traditional sense of the word, but I am still single very much in a legal way. I file my taxes single, I have to pay all of my student loans, and I'm currently the only person on my insurance. And I regularly do enjoy entering into single spaces just because they tend to be a lot more validating for me sometimes, especially when I'm feeling a little extra salty around non-monogamy. Occasionally, I do still get shit from single people who believe I shouldn't be allowed to call myself single no matter what. Sometimes they seem to almost purposely go out of their way to misunderstand what solo polyamory is. But overall, I will say that these spaces have been very positive and good for me and are very helpful to start thinking about the way that our lives can be lived separate from the traditional coupled norm.
Part 3. Let's nip some rebuttals in the bud.
Okay, I'm done sitting on the floor. My ass hurts now. There are some comments and questions that solo polyamorous people get quite often that, just to be thorough, we should probably go through and address those now. That way I don't have to do it later in the comments. And to help me out, I've got in front of the channel and Mayo fascist scholar, Harker the Storyteller, to play the role of concerned citizen. Take it away, Harker.
Don't you just mean promiscuous?
Did I fucking stutter? Some solo polyam people may indeed consider their life one of promiscuity. That's totally true. However, that's a very narrow view ultimately. For one thing, that tends to describe more casual, fleeting sort of sexual relationships, which not everyone is into. Plus, some solo polyamorous people are in fact asexual, so that aspect of it doesn't come into play at all. Personally, I find the idea that someone's life, including casual sex, somehow makes them less worthy of serious consideration to be kind of weird. I mean, I don't know, but like swingers, for example, have casual sex. It doesn't mean they don't take that lifestyle very seriously. There are podcasts, books, entire thriving communities for swingers. Throwing a just in front of it sounds really dismissive. I mean, I am a promiscuous slut, but that has nothing to do with any of this. I would be a promiscuous slut no matter what my relationship structure. You just try to stop me.
Okay then, but if you still have partners, why are you still calling yourself single?
To be fair, not all solo polyam people are on board with calling ourselves single, especially as that can sometimes be a little confusing when we're trying to discuss our romantic relationships. In fact, I imagine some of them would be rather horrified by how much of this video is focused on single living, so this is actually a really fair question. Maybe it would help you to think of single as being an almost political identity here. Those of us who are reclaiming it and using it are doing so to show how we are just not interested in a more traditionally entwined relationship. It's a radical rewriting of the term. Showing how complex the identity of single can be can allow for some very interesting discussions and examinations of that concept. Plus, I'm going to call myself wherever I want, actually. Thank you very much.
But how can you be in a relationship where you don't prioritize what your partners want?
I'm not callously just telling my partners take it or leave it with any of the major decisions I'm making. I'm still having conversations with them and getting their input. For example, if I was going to move to New Zealand for a great opportunity, I would have a conversation with each of my partners about it and see how they feel, getting their input and just sort of seeing how everything gets affected. We might discuss ways to connect despite the long distance, whether or not they want to come with me, or if maybe we need to de-escalate things because that's just ultimately going to be the better choice. I may even decide not to move to New Zealand at all because I realize that those local connections mean ultimately much more to me. The thing is though, I would never ask permission to move. Ultimately, that's the decision I would make by myself. Everyone's feelings are considered, but ultimately the consensus is just for myself to make. I bear all of the responsibility for that decision. And yeah, there's a little bit of a downside to that. Just having to face the consequences of my own actions without being able to blame anybody. And personally, I think I'd much rather structure things in this way. Because if not, if I was always putting a partner's feelings first and ultimately doing what they wanted me to do, then I might build up a lot of resentment over all the opportunities I wasn't able to pursue because of them. And that sounds like a lot less fun to me.
You don't expect to have equal standing with someone's spouse of a decade or more, do you?
I don't think I ever said that or implied it. When I say that it's important for me for my partners to sometimes prioritize me, I'm not saying that I expect the exact same level of access and intimacy that someone will build with a partner that they've had for, literal decades of being together. What I'm saying is that as we grow closer and we build that connection together, I do at times want to feel like I'm important to them. If my birthday is coming up, I would like each of my partners to make, some effort to check in with me that day, maybe do something a little special with me, like saying happy birthday to me over Zoom or something. I'm not expecting somebody with, a whole holiday routine and tradition to drop everything, all their family and friends and their primary partners, and just immediately come and hang out with me for the day. My birthday is Christmas, that's why I'm talking about the holidays. Basically, I don't expect to be treated equally, but I do expect some measure of equity. If I have a partner who never seems to prioritize me, I'm probably never going to prioritize them back. And that's going to severely limit how much that connection can actually grow and develop.
But how do you decide who to fluid bond with?
Bold of you to assume I'd want to fluid bond with anyone. Okay, so before I answer that question, I actually have to first answer the question of what is fluid bonding in case anybody watching at home isn't familiar with it. Fluid bonding is when two, or I suppose more, people decide to have some kind of sexual relationship without using barriers, condoms, dental dams, that sort of thing. In traditional monogamy, fluid bonding almost always comes after the declaration of exclusivity. Whereas in non-monogamy, fluid bonding tends to be reserved for primary partners. Now, for me and a lot of other solo poly people out there is no desire to fluid bond. Ever. with anyone. I personally find it's just a lot easier to say, hey, if you got a dick, you got to put a condom on. If you got a pussy, maybe we get a dental dam going. Much easier to have that all-encompassing policy as opposed to like just picking some special person to, reward with my unbarriered pussy. Plus, I personally don't want to have babies at all. And I've, done my part. I've made my womb a hostile environment, but just putting on a condom, it just really helps to ease that stress about fertile outcomes of sex. It should also be noted that sometimes people can't fluid bond because one or more of their partners might have an STI. STIs are stigmatized way too much for my liking, but it is true that sometimes they can be very harmful for people, especially if you have a weakened immune system. So for somebody who has maybe one or more partners with an STI, having any kind of barrier-free sex is just literally not an option. Also, it is possible to have sex in ways in which your fluids wouldn't be bonding with anyone else's fluids. People get creative.
So you just hate commitment?
I swear, if every non-monogamous person on the planet had a nickel for every time we've been told that we just don't like to commit, we could take all of our collective nickels and buy ourselves a really big steamroller, and then we could just run over anyone who's ever said that to us. Not that we would do it, I'm just saying. It'd be very satisfying. Solo polyam people in particular tend to get this sometimes even from other non-monogamous folk, so we're doubly misunderstood. So fun. I talked about this a bit in my relationship anarchy video, but the desire to not have a traditionally enmeshed relationship is not the same as not wanting commitment. In fact, sometimes when solo polyamorous people say that they are that because of not wanting commitment, they get dragged by pretty much everyone in the community. In fact, that's what happened with this New York Times article entitled, "My Choice Isn't Marriage or Loneliness."
I came across a term online, solo polyamory. It described a person who is romantically involved with many people, but is not seeking a committed relationship with anyone. What makes this different from casual dating is they're not looking for a partner. And the relationship isn't expected to escalate to long-term commitments, like marriage or children.
Seriously, y'all, if you were not on non-monogamous Twitter at the beginning of 2021, you missed out on some drama. It was, whew. I think the issue here is that the word commitment can mean a lot of different things to different people. For some folks, commitment can mean going to an event with a friend, or committing to getting up every morning and getting in that workout, or perhaps watching the entirety of the Highlander series from the 90s, because you're committed to watching really ridiculous special effects. If we're talking about what we tend to typically think about commitment in terms of like exclusivity, then yeah, I guess I'm not really interested in that. But I still really like the idea of long-term commitment and connections. I personally think I'm a very loyal friend and lover, at least I tried to be. And while I don't really like the idea of traditional marriage, I just have a lot of issues with the actual institution itself. I'm not necessarily against maybe one day doing some kind of commitment ceremony with a partner or two, depending on if that feels right for us. So to answer the original question, no, I don't hate commitment. I just don't see it as a snare that keeps me from making multiple commitments.
If someone lives with a partner, are they still solo polyamorous?
Oh God, this question. Everyone strap in, it's gonna take a bit. There are some people who consider themselves to be solo polyamorous while still having certain aspects of their life that are a bit more enmeshed than normal. People who maybe share their finances or cohabitate with partners. Hell, occasionally I've even met married people who use the term. But there are also some people who feel that if you are solo polyamorous and then cohabitate with a partner, it just completely voids that label. Some of them get pretty passionate about it too. Now, if you're asking if I personally believe someone can be solo polyamorous while still living with a partner, then the answer is yes, 100%. As great as it would be for every solo polyam person out there to be, strong, independent person who don't need no roommates, the fact is there's a lot of reasons why we might have to live with people. The rent is just too damn high. Sometimes regulating our own moods is vastly improved by living with other people, especially if you have a mental illness, for example. And also, some of us do have disabilities that require a helping hand. I actually once joined the smaller solo polyamory group that at the time I joined it because I thought it was for people who were solo polyamorous but also single, like in the traditional sense, because at the time I didn't have any partners at all. And very quickly I realized I had made a mistake. The vast majority of posts in this group were just dedicated to complaining about fake solo polyamorous, people who had to live with partners, God forbid. I remember specifically the comment that caused me to actually leave this group. There was a discussion around the usual topic, fakers and all of that, and someone brought up the very good point that not everybody can afford to live alone. And the response was to say, well, then they should just live with roommates instead of a partner. If you don't have friends or friends of friends who are looking to move around the same time you are, then that means basically trying to find, someone through Craigslist or a group or something like that, essentially a stranger. And not everybody wants to risk living with a stranger who they don't know, especially if they have had previous bad experience with roommates. Like me! Oh my God, the stories I could tell. So no, screw you. If I'm ever in a position where I need to move and I have a partner that I can live with who also wants to live with me, then I'm just gonna live with them. Like, oh no, I'm gonna not do it because some rando in a private Facebook group is angry about it? Ooh, no, scary. I get the argument that a solo polyam person who lives with a partner is going to benefit from some perceived couple privilege from the outside world. I understand that completely. But I think the idea that living with a partner equals the exact kind of codependent cohabitation that happens in monogamy shows a real lack of imagination. The partner they live with may also be solo polyamorous. They may sleep in separate bedrooms. By only looking at cohabitation through a coupled normalized lens, these critics are actually revealing their own biases and difficulty in uncoupling themselves from that particular norm. But ultimately, that is just how I feel about it. I am not the end-all be-all authority on polyamory. Yet.
Part 4. Solo doesn't mean alone.
Our framework for understanding solo and single living is massively flawed. Far too many of us see the lack of a verified, certified partner as missing something. Hell, in that last sentence, I said the word lack, which denotes a kind of hole in our existence. If we continue to look at single and solo living through this framework as being the opposite of coupledom, then we're missing the actual point. We are unnecessarily limiting ourselves and others. Humans are highly social, empathetic, and an enmeshed group of creatures. While there are some people who truly do want to live out in the middle of the woods and have no contact with anybody ever, I am here to validate my hermit grumpy viewers. Most people still require and enjoy some level of community. But how those communities are formed can be unique. They don't have to follow this norm of straight breeding pairs creating legacies through blood and names. We can customize it. We can create caring, loving communities and still be autonomous individuals. We can deeply, deeply love our partners and still enjoy sleeping in our beds alone at night. Look, I'm kind of a kicker, so honestly, I'm showing how much I love you by not having you sleep in my bed with me. The creation of new communities, ones made in spite of the accepted norms, can be loving and wonderful and truly life-saving. For example, in Going Solo, when discussing the creation of queer communities,
the historian George Chauncey has documented how gay friends in New York City helped each other identify places where landlords and neighbours were tolerant, recruiting other gay men for adjoining units, lest someone more judgmental and intrusive move in. Entire neighbourhoods in Greenwich Village, Chelsea, Hell's Kitchen, the East 50s and 60s became gay enclaves, organised around bars, cafeterias, cheap restaurants, literary societies and community centres that helped men support each other in the quest to define themselves.
I have joked more than once that my ideal living situation is one in which me and all of my friends, lovers, families are living in a shared unit together, like an apartment building or a dorm or a big old spooky mansion cleansed of ghosts. We could all have our separate autonomous space or live with partners if we choose, but then we could have communal spaces where we all come together to connect, to make dinner, watch movies, to play. I could be alone in those moments when I need to, like when I'm filming a video or when I'm working on some new jokes or perhaps just when I need to decompress from people for a little bit. But I also would be in a better position to then reach out to those when I do need somebody, like someone to hold the camera for me for once, or to give me some feedback on a joke that I'm still workshopping, or maybe just to give me a nice long quiet cuddle when my mental illness is being particularly rude to me. That doesn't sound like being alone to me. I live as somebody who is a member of many interwoven communities. There are my personal communities, of course, friends, lovers, family. But then there's the main community, the queer community, God, I love the color purple so much, it's a wonder I don't bleed periwinkle community. I'm also a part of the polyamorous community, and more recently, the YouTube community. Two communities in particular that, if I had to navigate completely on my own, I would just be so overwhelmed. And thankfully, I don't have to do that. Thank you, baby Cthulhu. And you know, maybe one day, I won't be so obviously solo. Again, I'm a relationship anarchist too. I don't really like to make assumptions about how my life is going to work out. Not to mention, the gentrification of Portland does seem to make it inevitable that eventually I will have to live with someone again, so maybe get on that, Mills? And honestly, the way the pandemic has gone so far, it has been really challenging living on my own. I'm an extrovert. I actually really enjoy filling up my free time with social interactions, events, things like that. And obviously during the pandemic, I haven't really been able to do that as much. So the prospect of living with somebody has actually been taking on a special kind of sheen, making me question how much longer I do have in that little cellar dwelling of mine. In fact, how non-monogamous people have been dealing with the pandemic is the subject of my next video. I'm not sure if you all have noticed this, but the media has kind of just not really been paying attention to how our communities have been dealing with this pandemic, and personally, I'm a little annoyed by that. So, my next video will be doing a bit of a deep dive into how non-monogamous people have been dealing with this. Now, unfortunately, because there isn't a lot of research out there for me to go with, I actually am going to be needing your help at home. If you go down below in my description box, there is a link to a Google Drive survey, hopefully not too janky, that you can click on and fill out the answers to. All the answers are optional. You do not have to fill out anything you don't want to, but giving that feedback will definitely help me for my next video. And the survey does go into a bit more detail about how those answers will be used. If I ever decide to live with a partner again or have a more traditionally enmeshed relationship, I will do so mindfully, and I won't have to do it by myself. I have one hell of a support structure. Because, babes, I'm about as opposite alone as you can be.
Folks, I do not know if Mandy's gonna have the wherewithal to call you to attention like this, so I'm gonna do it for her. If you liked this video, click like. If you think someone else would like this video, click share and make sure they see it. In fact, share this video with everyone you know. And if you like what Mandy's doing, and you want to support her work, well, you can head to patreon.com and support her there.
Yeah, you better fly away. I'll come up there.